Teachers, what is the worst thing you've seen a student do? Story 1. I was teaching for 3 months in a terrible inner-city school in London, UK. Terrible, because the school's management was super ridiculous and refused protecting or standing up for their teachers. I quit after 3 months. At the end of the first term, the school begged me to stay and promised me a pay increase. Here are some highlights. A female 15-year-old student pulled out a used tampon from her vagina during class and chucked it on my colleague's female face, telling her to shut up. A 16-year-old female student spat on my face while calling me a fucking poof. The school's head teacher put her on detention for an hour as punishment while the student was laughing at me saying, "You see? All I got is a free lesson now, fuck off." The school refused to suspend her and let me know that if I call the police to charge her with assault, they will support the student and refuse to acknowledge the attack to protect the school's reputation. A male student smeared his feces on a huge wall in the boys' toilet, writing shit with it. This place was a nightmare. Story 2. Taught a group with severe emotional and behavioral disorders for a while. Had a particular kid with oppositional defiance disorder. He'd later be diagnosed with conduct disorder that lied to get his foster mom arrested. He was constantly lying, always had some kind of investigation going on me, fosters, counselors, other teachers. He stupidly recorded himself jumping off a second-story ledge. Somehow he broke his wrist, not ankle. Well, he came to school. It was quickly noticed because he was complaining, obviously. He said his foster mom broke his wrist that morning because she's evil. Of course, he goes to the nurse, front office deals with EMS, and start my call to CPS. I don't investigate, I just report. Because EMS had to be called, the foster mother was informed. Apparently, she was going through his phone at the same moment and was about to call the school because she saw the video he took and was rightfully worried. She was pissed when CPS came to investigate, but it was closed quickly because she had proof the kid did it to himself. This kid tried to stab me with scissors, successfully stabbed my hand with a pencil, tried to choke a lost first grader in the bathroom, among so many other incidences. I remember foster mom sobbing, telling me about how he tried to sabotage her medication, picked the lock on the kitchen knife box, and repeatedly stabbed their locked bedroom door. I don't scare easily, but that kid was scary. I had him from 3rd to 5th grade and was so relieved when COVID hit and I didn't have to see him in person anymore. I'd never let him know that, of course. I always told him that I forgive him and that I love him. I got anxious just typing this out. Story 3. I've never had any violent interactions, but I did have a student get increasingly flirty with me once. Well, more than once, but this one takes the cake. About 3/4 of the way through the semester, I had to tell her I'm not going to bang a student of mine, college. I failed to make it clear about what my policy was on after the class was over, hookups, I guess, because the last day she showed up to class in a miniskirt and bent over in the aisle between desks to flash her commando ass and pussy to me. Just bonkers. She didn't realize how that not only is sexual assault, that I'm married, so what the fuck? This is a fucking ethics class. I already told you to get off my dick, etc. I've never seen being hot go to someone's head so much. She just obviously had never been told no once in her life. Story 4. Saw a boy stab a girl in the eye with a pencil. Luckily for her, the pencil was blunt, and he missed her eyeball and got the bridge of her nose instead. The boy bullied other boys and girls, as long as they were smaller than him. I called the principal. The little girl still had the pencil mark on her nose. Boy was taken out of the class, but sadly there were no long-term consequences. I think he just got talking to from the principal. The girl was more surprised than hurt. She did not even cry. But I was horrified. On another note, I remember Billy. Billy was a good kid, doing well in school. Then his parents decided to make him a boarder at the school. Billy's parents lived so close you could see his house from the school, but he was no longer allowed to go there. He lived in the school now, like the other boarders, but he could still see the home he was no longer allowed to go to. His behavior went from good to bad. He stopped doing any work and misbehaved all the time. I was a teacher, but I also lived at the school. A private school. One day I walked past Billy, who was sitting on a stair and crying while looking at a picture he held in his hands of his mom and dad. After a few years, he was allowed to be a day boy instead of a boarder. His mom and dad let him go home again. But Billy's personality had changed, possibly permanently. This was about 15 years ago. Story 5. I started work at a last chance school a few years back. The school itself is a very, very old building, like has a historical designation and a plaque and all that. Needless to say, it's falling apart and the student body is reckless and violent. So there are probably more holes in the wall than necessary. It was maybe my second week here and I was getting used to everything that was not like my student teaching experience. We had a student who was in 7th grade, but he hadn't physically or mentally developed past the age of 7. Super adorable little kid. And then I heard his story and Christ, I don't know how any of these kids survive their homes, but this kid had it real bad. Anyway, the kid pulls down his pants, climbs the old electrical piping up the wall until his crotch is parallel to one of the holes, and just straight up puts his willy in there and starts humping. SRO arrived and took care of the situation, and outside of needing bleach for my eyes and memory after seeing this, everything was fine. The other kids in the class were even grossed out by it, and they were used to this kid. When the student returned to class after suspension, I had a chance to ask him what he was thinking when he acted out like that, and his reply was that the hole reminded him of his grandmother, and that's what his grandmother makes him do to her. Story 6. Very high-needs high school student with developmental issues, brain issues, personality disorder issues, etc. with a pretty rare medical condition. At baseline, she was one of the sweetest little things you've ever seen. Super sweet, polite, yet kind of delicate and dainty. I'd be sitting there working on tasks with her until a switch suddenly went off in her head. You could see it happen. Her eyes would suddenly change, her facial expressions would turn to a creepy, devious expression with behaviors to match, and the way she carried her body changed too. She honestly reminded me of a female Mr. Burns because she would hunch her back further and would touch her fingers together while cackling with excitement like Mr. Burns does on The Simpsons show. The more mild behaviors looked like trying to grab or scratch at you, swearing at you, throwing things and clearing things off the desk, so pretty harmless. Her more severe behaviors were disturbing. She would start touching herself and mimicking sexual behavior, then she would just start masturbating while staring at me deeply as she talked smack at me. She wouldn't stop, and any and all attention made her behavior worse. So, at that point they would cordon her off with gym mats for privacy and switch me out with the female staff. I was so thankful because it was pretty uncomfortable stuff to experience. If she was having her period, she would get extra devious and would paint the walls and mats with her period blood. That's when she would be sent home for a couple of days. I don't mean this to be crude or disrespectful to the youth because she really couldn't help it, but that was honestly disturbing. I'll just never unsee/unthink that experience, and it's been a couple of years now. Story 7. I watched a child bite a chunk out of another student's arm as we were trying desperately to separate them. He then went after the other children in the room because he didn't like that they were looking at him. We have a rule to never physically restrain a child, but after watching this nightmare unfold, one of the assistant teachers held him back from the other kids by wrapping his arms around the kid's upper arms and sitting with him until support, the parents, or the police showed up. We evacuated the rest of the kids out of the room and into another classroom, trying to keep them calm and out of harm's way. They were obviously extremely scared. After not too long, we heard the situation was being dealt with and to go back to our classroom. The kid had scratched up the TA's arms like a feral animal, literally clawing, kicking, and screaming while covered in another child's arm blood. Also managed to pluck out a good amount of the TA's arm hair. Apparently, according to the kid, all this occurred because another kid threw a gummy bear at him. He was suspended for 2 days. The kid who got bit was suspended for a day. Admin acted like it was the teacher's fault all this happened, and the TA who restrained the child got fired for violating policy. I quit not too long after being screamed at by my boss because I didn't handle the situation and instead tried to protect the other kids by getting them out of there and into a separate classroom. Story 7. A different type of bad than most of these. I was a teacher at a poor inner-city school. I had a lot of wonderful students, but some difficult ones. One was the worst, clearly bright, but was always sleeping through class and acting up and never doing homework. I lived about 30 minutes away. One night, I stopped by the local Wawa after a night out with friends. It was at least 11:30 p.m., and I was already dreading the early morning drive to school. And who should be checking me out but my own problem student? He was working late to make money for his family and then getting home at 1 a.m. or later before heading into school on 4 to 5 hours of sleep. He was a smart kid. Really smart. I hope things worked out for him, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if he'd been allowed to have a childhood and focus on his education. Story 8. Summer camp counselor, rather than teacher, but close enough. We had a girl at camp one week who had some sort of mental/emotional issue. I have no idea what it was. You're only typically told the specifics for kids in your cabin, which you are directly responsible for, but you could just tell she was off. Very sweet kid, maybe 6 to 7 years old, but had a lot of trouble with impulse control. Well, one night, my campers and I were in our cabin. It's past lights out, so everyone's in their bunks, asleep. I'm just dozing off when I hear the door open, which I immediately register as odd, because I'm pretty sure I didn't hear anyone leave to go to the washroom, meaning all my kids should be accounted for. I roll over, look at the door, and discover this girl standing in the doorway without a stitch of clothing on her. Given that she's walking into a boys' cabin, this is obviously a very bad thing. I had to quickly leap out of bed, grab her, and get her outside, which led to me carrying her back to her cabin, because she didn't think to put on shoes and had cut up her feet walking to my cabin. It led to a whole to-do, because camp policy is to never have an adult alone with a child, and, for obvious reasons, that policy is doubly applicable when the child in question is naked. So I had to fill out a small novel's worth of paperwork in the aftermath to cover my/our asses from a liability standpoint. We also had a counselor's meeting about that, discussing strategies to keep her in her cabin at night and what to do if she went wandering again. Story 9. Countryside High School, not the U.S., in the early 1990s. There was a student that all the other students hated. He was a snitch and a bootlicker, and to make it worse, he was having an affair with a very cute middle school teacher. So they decided they would beat him up. In my class, I heard them talking about it and told them not to, which they interpreted as that they could beat him up in the corridor just before my class. So I intervened and physically protected their target. In the melee, one of the other students thought he could land me a punch, but I managed to block it and by reflex almost punched him in the face. Thankfully, I stopped 1 centimeter before I crushed his nose. He got scared and apologized with a very white face. Next week, he stayed after all the other students left for recess and pulled a gun, a .38 revolver, on me. I grabbed it away from him, took the ammo out and put the rounds in my pocket, and told him I would keep the ammo, but he had to hide the gun before anybody else saw it, or the headmistress would certainly call the cops and he would go to jail. He put it back in his backpack, and I told him that he should think about the consequences of his acts, for it was the second very stupid thing he had done in a very short time, and either he put his act together or he would become a petty criminal. Always in and out of jail, unable to hold a job and lead a decent life. Later I learned that his mother was a prostitute who lived with a guy who had been expelled from the police, so the gun was probably his stepfather's. Some 5 to 8 years later, I was walking down the main avenue in a bigger city 2 hours away from where it had happened, and I saw someone run across the traffic in my direction. It was that kid, now a young man. He wanted to thank me for what I had done then. He had realized he didn't have to go that way, had put his act together, and was working hard and living by himself, having left his tragic early life behind. I was very glad. It's wonderful when we can have a good influence on one of our students. That's the core of being a teacher for me. Story 10. The boys in this one class had an extremely strong hierarchy. One of the boys was the king of the hill, and all the other boys would do anything he said or wanted them to do. These boys are 10 years old, by the way. If you asked who was the strongest in the class, all of them would yell out his name, and if someone disagreed, they would attack him and harass him until he agreed that the king of the hill was the strongest. Same goes for the smartest, coolest, best looking, and everything else you can imagine. He could ask the other students to clean up his desk or bring him something, and they would do it instantly. At recess, he was always the team leader, and if you asked which team won at the end, they would simply say his name. I can name countless more times and moments of how strong his leadership was. However, let's get to the bad part. In the dressing room before PE, the leader decided that they should all play a game where they strangle each other. This game was that he strangled each and every one of them, and if anyone wanted to, they could strangle him as well. Of course, nobody dared to do that. So after strangling everyone, a teacher found out about this, and still the boys protected him, saying it did not hurt and it was a fun game. Horrifying to think of what those children had to go through.